Hey guys, welcome to this latest video. Today I'll be sharing all of my settings with you and I'll go over the rationale for choosing each setting. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the specs of my PC because it's not going to be relevant to you, my settings, if your PC has a completely different specification. So let's go over those then. So I first built the PC in 2018 using a i5-9600K processor. The problem I have with the processor is although it's quite a fast processor, it's not capable of hyper-threading, and you kind of do need hyper-threading for flight sim. Then the sim is installed on an NVMe M2 SSD, 500GB Samsung. Pretty important to have a high-speed SSD with the sim, installed on it, because for downloading your rolling cache data and this kind of thing, it's pretty important to keep things running smoothly. So something to bear in mind there. For RAM, I've got 32GB. It's not super exciting RAM. It's just your bog standard. It's actually quite slow. It's not high performance, but it is pretty decent. In the next video, I'll have a look at how much RAM you actually need. So I'm going to go over optimizing the sim for your own individual hardware. So we'll go over RAM in a bit more detail in that video. And then last of all, and perhaps most important, is the GPU. So I'm using a 2-year-old GPU that I got off of eBay secondhand. So that's the sort of main upgrade I've done since making the PC. It's a 4070 Super with 12GB of VRAM, and VRAM is pretty important. I think nowadays with Microsoft Flight Simulator 24, you're going to struggle with, if you've got an 8GB GPU, I would say. So that would perhaps be your upgrade path if your PC is only has 8GB VRAM, for example. My personal upgrade path is going to be to improve the processor to get one with hyper-threading. So, enough of that. Let's get into the settings, which is what you've all come for. Quite a few settings, isn't there? So it's going to take a while to get through all of them. Some of these I haven't decided on completely, so to some extent it's a work in progress. So you should subscribe to see how the work in progress progresses, as it were. And also in a future video, I'm going to be looking at optimizing your PC or your sim for your individual PC hardware. So that's going to be quite important. We'll be looking at airliners. I know that a lot of you fly airliners, and there's quite a difference in the sort of settings that you need if you're flying an airliner to if you're flying a GA aircraft like I am today. So my sim is set up for the GA aircraft, so something to bear in mind. But like I say, future video, next video perhaps, not sure yet. But very soon I'll be going over optimizing the sim using an airliner. So let's get into the settings then. Display mode full screen, of course. HDR, I don't have it on because for the purposes of YouTube, I don't use HDR. So I like to keep it simple. But I prefer HDR, right? So I think the lights at night look a lot better using HDR. So something to bear in mind. Exposure compensation there, that is personal preference. I've turned it down a little bit to try and prevent that sort of white, very bright white issue that you get where the color white on my machine looks super bright. Resolution, my monitor does actually go to 4K, but I'm trialing a 2K resolution at the moment. To me, it looks fine actually. And in any case, I record the videos in 2K. So for me, it seemed to make sense to try 2K for a bit, and obviously I get better performance. Anti-aliasing, I'm using the NVIDIA DLSS Super Resolution set to quality, which was the best compromise I could find. I tried TAA, DLAA, this gives you, in my opinion, the best performance compromise with sort of performance and image quality. AMD Fidelity FX sharpening, then personal preference again. I've got it on 90. I find if I go much higher than that, it starts to look a bit sort of grainy. I don't like that look. Max frame rate. So I've got 40 frames per second set, and using the frame generation, that's doubled to 80. So as I mentioned, frame generation obviously off. I did try this yesterday with the AMD version. So I saw some people saying that AMD gives a smoother experience. For me personally, I didn't find that. So with AMD, it seemed like when the frame rate was not the best, it kind of, the way, hard to describe, right? The way that it stuttered was smoother. But I find that with DLSS, I'm less likely to see stutters. So for me, it was better to use the NVIDIA DLSS. Where are we? Down here, dynamic settings. So I am using dynamic settings at the moment. I've got it the target set a little bit lower than the max frame rate. So that's going to be 70 frames per second, and the max frame rate is 80 frames per second because it's doubled by the frame generation, or more or less doubled. It's not quite doubled, is it? In fact, it is doubled. Anyway, so 35 frames per second here, that gives you 70. The idea being that if the frames dip significantly from 80, the sim will adjust the settings to prevent it from dipping further. So that can allow for a smoother experience. However, it does have a fairly significant effect on visuals. So my advice would be not to set it too high, if possible. I'll go over that again in more detail in the video about optimizing the sim. So moving on to global rendering quality. Train level of detail I've got set to 180. Obviously, the higher you go, it's a significant performance hog, as they say. The higher you go, you're going to have increased stutters, reduced frame rates, and so on. However, the higher you go, the better it looks. Less pop in and so on, the higher you go. So I'm using 180. I don't think that would be possible if I was flying an airliner. So then we have off-screen terrain pre-caching. The higher you set this, the better in terms of sort of stuttering and so on when you're panning, because as you can see, the idea with it is that it's caching data that is not currently visible. And then if you move the camera, the stuff that becomes visible due to moving the camera is already cached and is available straight away. Whereas if you turn this setting down, that data is not available, and therefore when you turn the camera, it has to load it from your SSD or download it or whatever from the internet, from the servers. So clearly, the lower you have, the less of a smooth experience you're going to get, because it's having to download that data before it can show it to you. The problem is having that setting high uses a lot of VRAM. So if you have a small, if your graphics card doesn't have a lot of VRAM, you might have to turn that down to avoid having VRAM issues. Displacement mapping, I've turned it off. The reason being, it's a flight simulator, not a walking simulator, and it's difficult to see the effect of displacement mapping when you're not on the ground. That said, it is super nice to see, when if you land the aircraft, get out, you can see if you land on the beach, for example, you can see the tire tracks in the sand. You can see plowed fields, so it looks really cool. But for me, for the amount of time I'm spending on the ground, it's not worth having it on, because it does have quite a significant effect on frame rate in my experience. Buildings high, I've not really finished experimenting with buildings. I don't see a great difference changing the settings. I've gone for high because I want to try not to max everything out. If you come down from ultra on a setting, you're going to get maybe 1 or 2 FPS back. And bearing in mind there are so many settings here, if you can come from ultra to high on a few of those, you're going to get 5, 10 FPS. So it's worth coming back from ultra if you don't notice a big difference. Trees, I've got it on high because mainly you have to have it above medium to have shadows thrown by the trees, so that's important. Plants, rocks, grass, similar rationale to displacement mapping. It's not a walking simulator. I'm not really generally going to get close enough to the plants, rocks, and grass to notice a big difference between medium and ultra, so I've got those on medium. Object's level of detail, I've actually cranked this up a bit from how I used to have it. In my previous video about the parked aircraft pop-in, I had it set right up to 200, and flying around London was actually pretty smooth, despite the fact that London is obviously a highly detailed, enormous photogrammetry city. So I figured might as well, I wanted to come down a bit from 200 because 200 is perhaps overkill, and is for sure going to introduce some kind of stuttering. Well, potentially. So I've come down to 150 for that reason, but it's a bit higher from like 100, which I had before. Volumetric clouds high. Used to use ultra. There is a slight difference between ultra and high that is noticeable, but it's a pretty demanding setting, one of the most demanding settings. So I've come down from ultra to high for that reason, to get those valuable extra frames. Then you got texture resolution. Don't really see much difference between ultra and high, but it does make quite a big difference to your VRAM usage. So personally, I think most people would probably be better off on high than ultra there. Anisotropic filtering, I've got that off. You can see more detail on that in my video about sort of visual artifacts in the water when you're flying using DLSS. Water waves, I'm on medium. I'm not spending a lot of time flying close enough to the water to see the difference between medium and ultra there. Ray traced shadows, that's a bit of a tricky one. It's quite performance intensive, but for my personal preference, really, when you're turning and the sun is moving across the cockpit and the shadows are moving across the cockpit, it looks quite bad, in my opinion, if you have the ray traced shadows off. With it off, you get a kind of shimmering effect, which might not be as noticeable if you're flying an airliner, because you don't, the sun doesn't come from behind, for example, whereas if you're in a GA aircraft with windows at the back, you get shadows thrown right across the dashboard and things, and it is quite immersion breaking, in my opinion. So for that reason, I've got it on despite the performance impact. Shadows. So I mentioned earlier on, it's a work in progress. This shadows is the area where I need to spend more time testing. So I've got these settings: shadow maps 1024, terrain shadows 256, contact shadows medium. It's sort of arbitrary, really. But at some point in the future, I'll spend some time pushing those higher and see what sort of effect it has, and whether I can get away with pushing those higher. So another video in the future on that might be worth a subscribe. Windshield effects high, because there's quite a significant difference between low and high in terms of the visual quality. It is kind of semi-performance intensive, so you could potentially come down from that if you need to get some frames back. But for me, it's worth having it on high for that extra performance, extra visual quality rather. Ambient occlusion, quite a big difference in that. That sort of adds a shading effect to the models and things. It's worth having that as high as you can go, because it looks a bit flat as you come down from the higher settings on ambient occlusion. Cube map reflections, another one I need to do more experimenting with. I don't really see any difference changing this setting. But yeah, some more time will be spent looking into that one. Ray March reflections, that's pretty performance intensive, so you might want to turn that down to get some frames back if you need to. However, it's a fairly significant difference in terms of the visual quality when you're over water. It's really nice to see those bridges and hills and so on reflected in the water, and that the quality of that is way better as you turn ray march reflections up. Obviously, I'm not using ultra because I want to get some frames back, as I mentioned earlier on as many settings as possible. Light shafts high. I don't see a huge difference in performance using this. I would probably put it on ultra, but I'm down on high for the reason mentioned earlier on. Depth of field, you don't see much of that really, do you? Unless you're using the focus on the drone cam, as you saw at the beginning of this vid. I'm using medium just because it's it's not really in use much. It's not a big deal. Motion blur, I've got it off. Personal preference. Visual effects, particles quality. I think that might be a new setting, possibly. It I don't remember it being there before Sim Update 5, but I've got it on low. I didn't see a huge difference between low and high. I'm guessing it's sort of smoke effects when you're landing and dust effects when your plane is going over like a sandy surface and that sort of thing. Glass cockpit refresh rate then medium. I think most people have it on medium. That's fine for me. You might want to consider turning it up if you're using an aircraft with a lot of the glass cockpit screens. Although if you are, then turning that up will probably have a more significant performance effect on your machine. Then here's another area that I haven't finished testing, I would say, characters. Yeah, tricky one, isn't it? So I've got the quantity on medium, the variety on medium, and the quality on high. In some of the settings, the higher you set the quality, the further away the whatever it is, characters, ships, or whatever, the higher away they're visible. So I've turned that up a bit for that reason to see if that reduces pop-in, but more testing required on that. Airport services quantity, got that on ultra because it's nice to see as much going on as possible around the airport. Variety, I've turned that down to medium because I feel like I perhaps wouldn't notice too much if there's lots of different things or not. Parked aircraft quantity and variety are off and low. The reason for that can be seen in my video about the parked aircraft pop-in. Aircraft traffic quantity, we've got medium, variety, medium. Variety probably doesn't matter. I'm using a third-party traffic injector to apply the models and liveries. So I assume that the injector is deciding what aircraft are being used. So probably I could have that to low and it wouldn't make any difference. Quantity, I've got it on medium. I don't have it too high. I find, in fact, that as you go higher, the aircraft tend to be very close to each other as they're taxiing, and it looks a bit unrealistic to me, like they're imminently going to crash. So I turn that down to medium, partly for that reason, and partly to get back some frames. Road traffic, medium. I don't see a huge difference between medium and ultra, so for that reason, I'm just going to use medium for now. Sea traffic, for me, this is quite important. What I see, anything below ultra, I see those ships popping in, which is not a nice thing to see. You may have noticed that I'm allergic to popping, and I think it looks really nice, right? You have it on ultra, and you can see like a ship a couple of miles away in the mist. Just looks super cool, and obviously looks way better than ships just magically popping in out of nowhere as you're flying around. And then fauna, that's the animals. So I've got the animals on medium. The animals are ridiculously detailed. I don't know if you've looked at any close up, but I got out of my plane and had a look at a horse. it was flicking its ears and blinking, and all kinds of unnecessary movements for something that you're looking at from hundreds of meters away most of the time or more. But the fauna is cool. The other day I drove home and there were cows in this field, and then when I went on the sim later on and flew over that same field, the cows were there, so it was almost like live cows. I'm guessing that's not actually possible, and it's just a coincidence, but it's kind of cool anyway. Um, Seatbelt visibility, I have seatbelts off. However, in my aircraft, seatbelts are very definitely visible, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Um, but I've got it off anyway because whether or not I can see the seatbelts is not terribly important. So that's all the settings. And one last thing I'll mention, when you come back out of the settings, having applied changes and things, often initially you're going to get a couple of stutters while the sim uh, sort of, I guess, applies the new settings that you've made, or reloads anything that has been unloaded while you've been in the settings, whatever might be happening. So straight after you go back into the sim, I would say if you get a little bit of stuttering initially, don't worry about it. Just give it a minute or so to settle down and see if those stutterings persist. I'll see if I can show you right now that's happening. So we go back and we resume. And yeah, well, actually, it's come back pretty smooth, hasn't it? But you may have seen the FPS counter initially was like 37, but it looked pretty smooth. It's kind of hard to tell actually when you're watching on YouTube because the video recordings are way less smooth than what I'm actually seeing with my current 80 FPS. Unfortunately, it doesn't come across that well on YouTube videos. So there we go, that's that done. I hope that was useful. As I say, please do subscribe, comment to let me know what you are interested in seeing videos about in the future, and also especially if you're interested in seeing the video about optimizing the sim for your own specific hardware. I think that's going to be pretty useful for most people. Alright, I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one.